Hey dorks! In the early 90s, Intel's processors for PCs began to overtake Apple's 68K offerings in terms of clock speed and performance. The Motorola 68000 series CPUs were quickly reaching their performance ceiling, so for Apple to maintain their already paltry market share, they needed to do something drastic. In 1991, Apple, IBM, and Motorola entered into an agreement known as the AIM Alliance in an attempt to create a new open standard for the entire computer industry. This alliance would encompass both hardware and software by developing a next-generation operating system called Taligent OS and a new RISC-based CPU known as Power PC. Over the years, Taligent OS was reduced in scope and morphed into an application framework for IBM's Unix offering AIX and faded into obscurity, while the Power PC processor line had far more commercial success.
Hello, I am Fred and I would like to introduce the new IBM entry-level workstation.
The fastest 68K-based computer ever released from Apple was the Quadra 840AV. This frustrating monster machine featured a 40 MHz 68040 and debuted in the summer of 1993 for a starting price of 4,100 red-blooded eagle bucks, with options taking it as high as 5,100. 1 year earlier, it was possible to find 50 MHz 486 PCs available in the $2,500 to $3,000 range, and by the time the Quadra 840AV was released, 50 MHz 486 PCs could be found for between $1,500 and $2,000. 66 MHz 486s were available for around $2,500, and the Pentium was right around the corner. Apple had a price-to-performance problem. Apple received the first PowerPC 601 CPU in 1992 and began designing a new machine around it, which would become the Power Macintosh 6100, 7100, and 8100 series in 1994.
There are 3 models of Power Macintosh available at this time, with various configuration options. The most affordable is the Power Macintosh 6160 in a slimline design. The Power Macintosh 7166. This unit is ideal for general business computing, and its design is based on the popular Quadra 650. And the highest performance model is the 8180, clocking in at 80 megahertz.
The 601 was just the first in a line of PowerPC processors that would drive the rest of the 90s for Apple's machines until they changed architectures again to Intel CPUs in 2006. The switch to PowerPC would bring massive performance potential to the platform and a big clock speed jump. In 1994, when the PowerMax launched, even the low-end 6100 at 60 MHz was a massive leap over the 840AV in terms of clock speed and computational power. But the operating system and the software running on it would need to be modified to take advantage of all that extra juice. As part of the transition to PowerPC, backwards compatibility with all the programs written for 68000-based Macs was paramount. To that end, Apple added 68K emulation to the PowerPC version of System 7. This means that the vast majority of the back catalog of software for Mac would still work with the new PowerMacs. It did this through a mixed mode manager to detect if the program contained 68K code. If it did, it funneled that portion of the program to the emulator. If there was no 68000 code, it would run directly. To make matters even more complicated, programs and components could contain both 68K and PowerPC code. Much of the operating system itself was still 68K code that needed to run through that same emulation layer. Power Macintosh 6100 debuted on March 14, 1994 at the price of $1,820. Also released at the same time was the $4,000 7100 and the 8100, which had a price of $4,250. The 7100 and 8100 were close enough in price that it really didn't make a lot of sense to get the 7100. But these prices were so much higher than those of the 6100 that it was clear they weren't for home users. The home user looking for a new Mac with a future in 1994 basically only had one choice, and that would be the Power Macintosh 6100. The processor wasn't the only change that Apple brought to the table with the new Power Macintosh line. They also introduced a new monitor, the Apple AudioVision 14 display. This new monitor featured a new display connector called HDI 45, which carried the video signal, stereo audio, and ADB to allow the computer to control more aspects of the monitor, such as brightness and geometry, as well as letting the monitor act as an ADB hub for your mouse and keyboard. The thinking behind it is that very little would need to be done behind the computer once everything was hooked up. The new line of Power Macs all had the new HDI 45 video connector. The new connector meant the old 15-pin video connector was out, so you either needed to get a new monitor or a dongle to be able to use your old one. Even the operating system itself would take a long time to move away from 68K code. The first fully PowerPC native version of the system software didn't appear until 1998 with the release of macOS 8.5. By that time, so much had been added to the system that the lowly 6100 was still just as pokey, even running fully native code. Apple was trying hard to stay relevant during the mid-90s and released PC compatibility cards for many of its systems. The 6100 was among those that would get a compatibility card, and in January, a version of the 6100 was available for purchase with the card pre-installed. This card featured a 486 CPU, Sound Blaster integrated on board, and up to 32 megs of RAM. These cards ran as a completely separate computer within a computer. Using a series of dongles, one could connect both their PC card and their Mac to the same monitor. People like to complain about Apple's habit of making people use dongles today, but I promise Apple users of the 90s were definitely living that dongle life back then too. So was the 6100 a good buy in mid-1994? At $1,800, a computer that runs most of its software as fast as a computer from 1991, it sure seems to me like it would be a poor choice. But what other choices were there for the home Mac user? Well, scouring the back pages of Macworld from April of 1994, there are plenty of used machines for sale that would perform only a little bit slower than the 68K performance of the 6100, like the Macintosh 2VX for around $1,000 or the Quadra 605 for $1,200. Or you could buy a brand new Quadra 630 from retail stores for $1,280. Sure, it's not a PowerPC based system, but the 630 has a 33 MHz 68040 in it, ran the same macOS 7.1.2 that came on the 6100, and the vast majority of available software for Mac would run faster on it than the 6100. The video connector on the 630 is the standard 15-pin video connector used on all the other desktop Macs up to that point, and the available PC compatibility card had internal connections for the video, so you didn't need any big dongles hanging out of the back of the machine. The 630 was also the first Mac with IDE, ushering in the days of cheaper storage options, while still keeping SCSI for the internal CD-ROM and external port. If you absolutely had to buy a new Mac in 1994, would the 630 actually have been a good choice when stacked up against a 6100? My friend and 630 fetishist Garth Beagle sure thinks so. I blackmailed him into doing some benchmarks for me so we could see how the 630 and the 6100 compared running 68K code. For this test, we ran Speedometer 3 to ensure no PowerPC code could stack the deck in the favor of the 6100. There are no real surprises here. The 630 with the 33 MHz 68040 scores extremely similarly to the 6100. Graphics performance on the 630 is lower. Math performance is leaps and bounds above the 6100, mostly because the 68K emulation reports no FPU to the benchmark tool. I ran software FPU instead, and as you can see, it's pretty bad. Disk scores here won't match what was around back in the day because these tests were done with the Blue SCSI, a modern-day SD card SCSI emulator, instead of spinning Rust hard drives. So there it is. The Quadra 630 was the better buy if you needed to buy a new Mac for your home in 1994. $1,200 versus $1,800 is almost a no-brainer. A cheaper system with near equal performance for the vast majority of home software, and no need for dongles to use the vast majority of Mac monitors available on the market. That's such an easy conclusion though, and kind of unsatisfying. Maybe there was something we could do to turn this 6100 into the Power Mac Apple should have released in the summer of 1994 instead of the one we got. Most computers of the time derived their clock speeds from the use of crystal oscillators. Tiny devices that contain quartz crystals that resonate at specific frequencies that can be used, among other things, to tell the CPU what clock frequency to run at. It was very common in the 90s to overclock PCs by swapping out the clock crystal with a faster one. Macs also used crystal oscillators to keep their clock speed. Lots of other elements in the machine also need a clock frequency, such as the expansion bus, so that can be problematic on old Macs to change the crystal to speed up the CPU, because you were also speeding up other things on the board. It made things really janky and unstable, and many times things just wouldn't work right. But the 6100 was different. The CPU had its own dedicated clock crystal, so changing it wouldn't affect those other things. On the 6100, the 60 MHz 601 CPU was driven by a 30 MHz crystal that was surface mount soldered to the logic board. The CPU then took this 30 MHz signal, multiplied it by 2, and used that as its instructed clock speed. It was time for some experiments. First, I ordered a new 40 MHz crystal from DigiKey to see if I could get the 601 in this thing to run at 80 MHz like the one in the 8100. I put the 6100 on my bench and used my hot air rework station to remove the original oscillator. The 6100 has mounting holes for through-hole oscillators as well, which is good for me, since the crystal I ordered was a through-hole part. Unfortunately, the part I ordered was the wrong size for the mounting holes, so I need to fashion some janky sockets to get it to work right. First, let's try a 30 MHz crystal to make sure it works right at stock speeds. So far so good. It boots and runs well. Let's go for 80 MHz. Well, that's working too. Time for some benchmarks. For this go-round, I called my friend Steve of the YouTube channel Mac84 and asked for a little help.
Yes.
Hey, is that the 840 AV?
Most of it.
Any chance I could get you to benchmark that thing for me? I want to compare it to something.
I gotta go.
So we both ran Speedometer 3, and the results are very surprising. The 6100 came out on top. In the summer of '94, the Quadra 840 AV was still commanding a $3,000 to $5,000 price tag in the back pages of Macworld. Sure, the Quadra has more expansion slots and heft to it, but there's no denying the results you could get with the 6100, a $4 crystal, and a little soldering. Back in the day, if you were too squeamish about soldering, you could get a clip kit to attach the new crystal to the existing crystal. My 6100 is equipped with the DOS card, so let's give that a try. Comes with a 66 MHz 486 and 32 megs of RAM. I've got a disk image with DOS Bench on it. How does Doom perform? Pretty poor. We got 12 frames per second. Let's take a look at SpeedSys. It detects our CPU properly, and we get a score of 24.7. Let's see how we do with Quake. Looks pretty sluggish. And there we go. It's 5.8 frames per second. Blistering speed. I think we might be able to do a little better. The 486 on this thing is socketed, so I'm going to pull it out and try some upgrade CPUs that I got from my buddy Ron at Ron's Computer Videos. These upgrade processors are interesting, if a bit compromised. They were intended for use on boards where just socketing a regular new CPU in was not feasible for one reason or another. They have voltage regulators built in to handle the different voltage demands of the new chip, and also usually have more robust cooling than the 486 required. First up is the AMD 5x86-133. The install is simple enough. Pop the factory provided 486 out of the socket, put the new CPU in. These sockets aren't marked for the orientation, so if you're playing along, look for the key pin and make sure that the CPU you put in matches. If your CPU doesn't have a key pin, it should still have a mark for you to match up to the key pin. When Apple designed this card, they made the brilliant decision of placing the 486 CPU directly above the PowerPC CPU. With these upgrade CPUs, the heat sinks actually make contact with each other, so to be safe, I'm putting in this janky fan I salvaged from a Pentium 4 system. The AMD CPU is a little bit faster at Doom, but it's not really perceptible. We get 13 frames per second, which is 1 frame better than the 486. SpeedSys gives us a score of 42.32. As for Quake, I wasn't expecting much. The 5x86 gets us 8 frames per second. Still not playable, but an improvement. I've also got an 83 MHz Pentium overdrive to try, which is interesting because it's actually made for a different socket. The extra row of pins are just extra voltage and ground pins, so I'm going to leave them hanging off the side and hope for the best. Firing it up, everything appears to work, so let's get to testing. First up is Doom, and our results are basically identical to the AMD. SpeedSys is increased a little bit to 53.22. Quake has a reputation of running a lot better on a Pentium, so I've got some great expectations here. Unfortunately, it's just a marginal increase to 9 frames per second. But there's probably a better way to play Doom and Quake on these machines anyway. I don't know of a good way to benchmark the Mac version of Doom, but this certainly looks better than 12 or 13 frames per second. The Mac version of Quake jumps up to an almost playable 11.7 frames per second. Now, that's not really fair since the Mac version of Doom didn't come out until 1995, and Quake didn't get a Mac version until 1997. So in the summer of '94, the only way you were playing Doom on a Mac was with a DOS card, and Quake wasn't even out for PCs at that point. So where does that leave us? What should home Mac users have bought in 1994? Power Macintosh 6100 and a crystal oscillator to make it decent? A Quadra 630? A PC running DOS and Windows 3.1? Who's to say? They're all decent options. But for me, the 6100 is the right brand of Crummy that I just can't say no to. Big heavy dongles, lots of promise of future performance once developers get up to speed on the new CPU, and a snobby better than you ad campaign backing it. 6100's got it all. I think Michael Spindler said it best.
You can move to Power Macintosh now, or you can move later.
Thanks for watching. If you're interested in watching me do more stupid stuff with computers, stay tuned.